let's turn to our Bible reading, to Exodus chapter 2, where we're going to read verses 1 to 10. Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 to 10, and I think the words will appear on the screen behind me. Here we go, Exodus chapter 2, verse 1. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying. She felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." Amen. And so it begins our new sermon series on Sundays and studies in midweek home groups in the book of Exodus, our sermon series, Discovering Identity in the Desert, our home group series, Freedom to Serve God, both looking at this book of Exodus. 2 key words in Freedom Church's vision statement: explore identity, community, and freedom through encountering Jesus. Exodus is a book of identity and a book of freedom. It describes the events in which the identity of the Jewish people were formed. And it is those events, therefore, that are our identity as Christians as well, the events in which our identity as Christians is rooted. And each week we're going to be opening up aspects of that identity. You'll be pleased to hear they all begin with the letter R, and we've emailed them out, so you'll see them there. Through the Bible readings, we're going to look at what the reading says, but we're also going to look at what the wider Bible says about each of those themes. And today, a royal people. A royal people. That's our R for this week. A royal people. So let's travel over 2,500 miles away and back over 3,500 years to ancient Egypt, where the story of the book of Exodus begins. And I've got 3 points, each beginning with the letter A today: the absence, the ark, and the adoption. The absence, the ark, and the adoption. Firstly, the absence. Now, why do I say that? Well, we've jumped straight into chapter 2 of the book of Exodus, and we ought to just bring ourselves up to speed with what we've missed in chapter 1. In that opening chapter, which sets the scene, there are a vast number of characters. It begins with Jacob and his 12 sons. They're in Egypt, which is where they were left at the end of the book of the end of the book of Genesis, the book before Exodus. And it was not only Jacob and his 12 sons. The descendants of Jacob, we're told, numbered 70 in all. So we've gone from 1 to 12 to 70. And then chapter 1, verse 6, Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. From 1 to 12 to 70 to almost an uncountable number. And there are other characters as well as these Hebrews, these Israelites. There's a new king in Egypt. We read of that in chapter 1. And all sorts of other Egyptians. And then as we get to the end of the chapter, there are a couple of midwives as well. It's a huge cast list. But who's missing? Who isn't mentioned in all of that cast of characters? God is hardly mentioned at all, except when it comes to the midwives at the end of the list, who fear God, and so he is kind to them. But in that extensive list of characters, God himself seems to be absent. And that's not a mistake of the author. He deliberately wrote like that because that was the way it felt to the people of Israel. The backdrop, the scenery against which this whole story is set was very dark and bleak. Their suffering was immense. Joseph had ended up as the highest man in the land, second only to Pharaoh, and he had saved not only Egypt, but the entire region from famine. And he was treated with great respect and honor, but the number of his descendants grew and filled the land, and then, chapter 1, verse 9, a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. Life suddenly became terrible. And the author piles phrase upon phrase to tell us just how dreadful it was. These slave masters worked them ruthlessly and made their lives bitter and harsh. And it all culminates in verse 22 with Pharaoh giving this order to all his people: every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Where was God in all of that? That's the point the author seems to be making. God is absent from the text because he seemed to be completely absent from their suffering. And we know how that feels, many of us, don't we? The sense of God's absence. It's not unusual in the Bible. It's not unusual at times in the Christian life. Where are you? How long, O Lord? Why have you forsaken me? Those are all biblical questions. We all go through dark times, spiritually, materially, circumstantially, emotionally, mentally. And yet all those questions in the Bible are asked against the backdrop of the unshakable confidence that God is good. And he does know that he is present, that he is working his purposes out for our good and for his glory, that he alone is the true source of comfort in the darkness. Though the people of Israel couldn't see it, and he appeared to them to all intents and purposes to be absent, though the backdrop, the scenery, was bleak and dark, God was at work behind the scenes. Never forget our behind-the-scenes God. And unbeknown to them, he was at work through the actions of various people as well. Some of us here won't be surprised at all to hear that the people he was particularly working through were the women. Some people are thinking, well, nothing changes there. It all started with the midwives. Pharaoh had commanded them to kill any Hebrew boys that were born, but we're told they feared God. That's the only reference to God in that chapter. And so they did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. And then there was Moses' mother. By the time she gave birth, Pharaoh had commanded that all the Hebrew boys be thrown into the river. She obeyed, but she obeyed with ingenuity, with creativity, we might say. Before she threw the baby into the river, she put him in a floating basket. Courageous thing to do in that political climate. And then there was Moses' sister. It was probably Miriam, who would become famous later in the story. She kept watch over the baby in the basket and had the courage to speak to the princess and came up with the ingenious plan, which meant that the baby was returned to his mother. She had obviously inherited her mother's creativity and courage. And then there's the princess who discovered the baby and had compassion on him and had the courage to disobey her father's order and even to bring the boy up in her father's palace. 5 extraordinary women. 2 midwives, the mother, the sister, the princess. When God seemed absent, he was still at work behind the scenes and at work through unsuspecting and unsuspected people when the days are dark and God seems to be absent. never underestimate what God can do and is doing through you and others around you. And these 5 women come to us through all the years of history as a remarkable example. It's not a bad lesson to learn. When the days are dark and God seems to be absent and it can be difficult to know what to do and easy to give up hope, and there have been very dark days when Christians have done these very things, look for the ways to be creative and courageous and compassionate. Throughout this series, we're thinking about discovering identity in the desert. This book describes the very events in the desert which shaped the identity of the Jewish people and therefore provide the roots of our Christian identity too. It's an identity that begins even before the desert in dark days of suffering. And the people of Israel were told never to forget it. Remember that you were once slaves in Egypt. That was to influence and shape the way they related to everybody else, especially the poorest in society. It was that identity that was to motivate them in their creativity and courage and compassion throughout all their lives and throughout their history. And it's the same for us as Christians. You once were slaves, but are slaves no longer. When you are in the darkness, never forget our behind-the-scenes God. Never underestimate what he is doing and can do through you and those around you. And always find the ways forward when all seems despair and hopelessness, the ways forward of creativity and courage and compassion. The absence, that's the first thing to notice this morning. Secondly, the ark. Another curious heading, the ark. What's that all about? James could tell you after his breakfast this morning, but we'll come on to that in a minute. As we come to the beginning of Exodus chapter 2, from which we've read this morning, we meet 2 parents. We're not told their names here, only that they were Levites, but later we discover their names are Amram and Jochebed. And by this stage, they already had at least 2 other children, Aaron and a sister, who may very well be Miriam. We're not told here. We're told very little about them, which seems to be because from that vast cast list of chapter 1, the author wants to focus the spotlight down onto just one person, a baby in a basket, with whom the entire salvation of the entire world hangs in the balance. That's quite a thing to put all your plans into, isn't it? And rest upon one baby in a basket in a river. And after Pharaoh issued his decree that all male babies should be thrown into the Nile, this Levite woman becomes pregnant. And then, perhaps, horror of horrors, she gives birth to a son. And then the author adds this rather curious comment at the end of verse 2. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. What does that mean? That she saw that he was a fine child, and that was what motivated her to hide him for all those months. Surely it can't mean that she thought he was a rather beautiful baby, and it would be a shame to throw such a beautiful baby into the river. Many mothers see their babies as beautiful, don't they? Despite sometimes it's been said rather overwhelming evidence to the contrary. But so it can't be about that, can it? It's in the original language of the Hebrew in which this was written that it makes sense. The word for fine is actually good. When she saw that he was good. When have you heard a phrase like that before? It's repeated 7 times in the creation account at the beginning of Genesis 1. When God saw what he had made was good. And that's the point. This is a new beginning. It takes us back to the beginning of beginnings, and here we have a new beginning for the people of God. Just like when John in his gospel tells us the story of Jesus. How does he begin? In the beginning. But he takes us back to the creation of the world to show us again that this is a new beginning for all people, including for you and for me. A new beginning. But we still haven't come to why I've called this second point the ark. I've already referred to Moses' mother's creative obedience. She did throw him into the river, and Pharaoh hadn't said that the boys couldn't be put in a floating basket before they were thrown into the river. She followed the letter rather than the spirit of the law. And here we come to it. We're back to the original Hebrew again. What word do you think is used for the basket? More literally, it says she put him in an ark. What does that remind you of? Story of Noah. The story is cycling around again. It's a new beginning, just like the creation of the world. It's a story of rescue, just like it was for Noah. Moses will be saved from a watery death, just like Noah was. The story of salvation all over again. A story that would be repeated fully and perfectly in Jesus, who would gather all who trust him into it. This is a repeated pattern of God's working in the world. And so for a moment in history, the entire salvation of the entire world hangs in the balance with this baby in a basket. We've touched on some of this already. Another extraordinary woman, the next character in that vast list, steps onto the stage. She went down to the Nile, this princess, to bathe. She saw the basket. She sent her attendant to get it. And verse 6, she opened it and saw the baby. He was crying. And she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. I was just reminded when I read that verse and was thinking ahead to this Sunday that there's a Christmas carol, isn't there, that talks about the little Lord Jesus. No crying he makes. And people like to make fun of that and say, well, what baby would have been? Well, I think we can understand that in a different way. But there was a baby, apparently, according to the carols, that wasn't crying. Here was a baby that is crying, and God works through them both. He works through the tears as much as he does through the smiles. Let those who have ears, let them hear, so to speak. And the very tears that put his life in danger in the first place, that meant that he had to be placed in the basket, came to be the tears that motivated the compassion that led to his salvation. And this princess wasn't even an Israelite. She wasn't related to the baby. She didn't have anything to gain. Her own father had given the order, disobeying your father, especially if he was the king in that day and age, carried the highest dishonor and the highest penalty, and she risked it all. It doesn't say that she feared God like the midwives, but it does say that she felt sorry for the baby. She felt pity. She had compassion on him. That's a mark of the image of God that all people carry, though it's expressed to greater and lesser extents and in different people. The ability to feel and show compassion. Incidentally, it's one of those evidences of the existence of God. There are all sorts of things that might cause us to question the existence of God, like his seeming absence and suffering. Where is God? Why is he letting all this happen? But one of the evidences of his existence is that unique ability we have for empathy and compassion. Where does that come from? We don't find it in wild nature. Do we not all have this compassion because there is one who is the source of all compassion, who has created us in his image and likeness to be compassionate like he is? While this sister steps fully onto the stage next and demonstrates that she has her mother's ingenuity, her creativity and courage, the slave girl steps forward and addresses the princess. Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you, she asks. I wonder what lengths this princess's compassion went to. I mean, what was there a reading between the lines? Did she know exactly what was going on? Did she know that in taking up the slave girl's offer, she was reuniting the baby with its mother? Who knows? Was there an unspoken understanding? And don't miss the silent heroines of the story. The attendants, they witnessed, they kept silent at risk to their own lives. More unsuspecting and unsuspected women through whom the Lord is working his purposes out. The ark, the story of God outworking his plan for the salvation of the world, is repeating itself. The pattern of the way God works in the world, and he uses everyone, even Egyptian princesses and Hebrew slave girls. He uses everyone in that process. The salvation of the world hangs in the balance with a baby in a basket, and yet God is at work, the ark. And thirdly and finally, the adoption. Such was the deep compassion of this princess that it was no fleeting thing. It wasn't here today and gone tomorrow. Sometimes we feel sorry for things, don't you? You might see a video of a cute little kitten or something on YouTube, but you've forgotten about it the next moment, you've gone on to something else. This princess remembered this child throughout all those years that the mother nursed him. How long was it? 2 years, 3 years, 4 years? And then verse 10, when the child grew older, she, that's his mother, took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. In the ancient world, it was generally the parents who chose the name for their children, as it is the case today. But in those days, the name that was chosen was believed to be much more significant than generally names of you today. And there's an amazing significance to the name that was chosen for Moses. As she named him Moses, she said, I drew him out of the water. And in Hebrew, the word Moses means to draw out. But of course, this princess wasn't necessarily a Hebrew speaker. She was Egyptian. And the name Moses in Egyptian, Moshe, simply means child. Her father, the Pharaoh, may well have been Ramesses II. You've heard that name? The name Ramesses is just made up of two words, Ra, the name of their greatest of the so-called gods, and Moshe, meaning child, Ramoshe, Ramesses. The name Moshe, Moses, was a recognizable name in ancient Egypt. The Egyptian princess gave her adopted son a new name, an Egyptian name, which meant he could be at home in the Egyptian palace, and yet it was the name that would have significance also for Hebrews, and which was strangely prophetic, because not only was Moses himself drawn out of the river, but he would go on to lead the whole nation of Israel out of Egypt through the water of the Red Sea, the adoption. And here's the amazing thing. In doing what she did for Moses, the Egyptian princess did nothing less than what God himself would do for the people of Israel. Just think back over what she did. She came down to the Nile. She saw the basket. She heard the crying. She had compassion on the baby. She drew him out of the river. She provided for him. After that apparent, though not actual, absence, when God appears on the stage at the end of chapter 2, this is what he does. He says he hears their groaning, their crying. He sees their suffering. He has compassion on them. That's in chapter 2, verses 23 and 20 to 25. And then in chapter 3, he famously says to Moses at the burning bush, beginning at chapter 3, verse 7, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I am concerned about their suffering. I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them out, draw them out of the land. You see, what God does for his people here is described in exactly the same language as what this princess does for Moses. This is how highly her role is valued within the whole outworking of Israel's redemption. And there is a familiarity to this story, to the way that it's told, because it simply is repeating the pattern of the way that God often works in the world. We're reminded of his creative work. The mother looks at her baby and sees that he is good, just as God looked at his creation and saw that it was good. We're reminded of his saving work. The baby is placed in an ark and saved from a watery destruction, just as God placed Noah in an ark and did the same thing for him. It reminds us of his redeeming work that so often begins with the birth of a child. Think of Isaac back in the book of Genesis, or Samson further on in the Bible, in the book of Judges, or the ending of the book of Ruth, the birth of a baby where all hope seemed to be lost. A baby who would be the grandfather of David, the greatest king Israel would ever know. And then fast forward on to the birth of another baby. When the pattern of God's saving work in this world is repeated and brought to completion perfectly in Jesus. And it's not only the pattern of God's work that is repeated here, but also the pattern of human response to him. It's the same old story. Human hardened their hearts, and there is dreadful destruction as Herod orders the murder of all the Hebrew boys, just as Pharaoh had done. And not only dreadful destruction, but also courageous compassion, as other human beings align themselves with God's purposes and work in partnership with him. An angel warns the Magi not to return to Herod and go home by another route. And so they don't return to Herod to betray the baby. An angel warns Joseph in a dream of the impending danger, and he obediently takes the boy Jesus to safety. Where does he take Jesus? To Egypt. The pattern is repeated in all sorts of different ways, at all sorts of different layers. And then he's brought back up out of Egypt. And Matthew in his gospel tells us, and so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. We go on, repeating the pattern time and time again. We could go into more detail if we had more time, but in a very symbolic way, Jesus went down into the deep waters of death, and there, 3 days later, he was drawn out to his glorious resurrection. And it's a pattern into which we're all invited to enter. Going down into the water, being drawn out again. It is a very powerful image in the Bible, and for Christians, as anyone who has been baptized will know full well. And just as the princess did for Moses what God himself would do for his people, so God himself will do for you. It all culminated in her adopting Moses as her son. And if you're a follower of Jesus, just think what God has done for you. He hasn't only given you new life. He hasn't only saved you. He hasn't only forgiven you. He hasn't only blessed you and given you gifts and a purpose for life and serving him. He could have done all those things and nothing more, and that would have been more than enough. And yet, on top of it all, he has adopted you and made you a member of his family. To all who received him, wrote John at the beginning of his gospel, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. And the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Romans, chapter 8, those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves, so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption. The Spirit himself testifies to our spirit that we are God's children. What an inheritance we have as adopted children. This is the beginning of our sermon series, which we've called Discovering Identity in the Desert. And our title for this first sermon is A Royal People. As followers of Jesus, we are children of the King. As Christians, that is our fundamental identity and the basis of everything else. We once were slaves to sin. We have been rescued, and we are adopted as children of the living God who reigns supreme. He has done all sorts of things for you as your creator, judge, savior, Lord, teacher, protector, provider. But he delights most of all to be your father and to call you his child. You are a child of the King, a member of the royal family, a royal people. And what if you're not yet a follower of Jesus? How do you enter into all these blessings? Well, Jesus had a beautiful story to tell, one of his most famous stories of a son who went away from his father and turned his back on his home and ended up living in a desperate state, just like those Israelites in Egypt. And eventually the son came to his senses and he turned around and he went back to his father. And the moment his father saw his son returning, he ran to meet him to welcome him home. Just takes a turning towards the Lord and a calling out to him, and he will do the rest. The key to knowing our identity is that we know who we are by knowing whose we are. Just think about all that this story of the baby in the basket shows us about who our Father is. We are a royal people. And ultimately, those who fear God, like the midwives, and those who do not, especially Pharaoh, They equally fulfill God's purposes. The difference is not in the effect it has on God's purposes, but the effect it has on them. Whether they experience the kindness of God because they have opened themselves to him and aligning themselves to his purposes, or whether they harden their hearts, both to God and the people around them. Great lesson to be learned from the life of Pharaoh. Guard your heart. The absence, the ark, the adoption, discovering identity in the desert. We are a royal people. As the Apostle John wrote in his first letter, chapter 3, verse 1, see what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God. Let's be quiet for a moment and respond to the Lord in our own hearts, and then we'll close with some more worship.